Today is Easter. So as a pastor, Easter is one of those Sundays that's both like exhilarating and it's also extremely intimidating. It's exhilarating because on any given Sunday you have roughly 85% of the people that's kind of connected with your church that will come. On Sunday, that's up to almost 100%. And then you have extra people. That's just kind of a cultural thing to come on Sunday. So it's extremely exhilarating and exciting in that way. It's also very intimidating because you have to come up with some sort of message that resounds, that makes sense, that people enjoy, but it's the same exact story. There's nothing new, right? I mean, you're coming to hear that, so it is a challenge. And in the words of the great Barney Stinson, if there's any fans of How I Met Your Mother, challenge accepted. Some of you guys got that. Some of you guys are like, I have no idea who that is. Go and Google How I Met Your Mother and you'll find out that. But challenge accepted. Everything is awesome. Most people expect to hear a sermon basically that says that. Everything is awesome during resurrection, during Easter. The problem is that's not reflective of most people's experience in life. So we're going to take a slightly different angle at the Easter story today. Really, we're going to look at the entire Easter story, and as Jacob prayed, all the way from Good Friday to Easter Sunday, through death into resurrection. And I want to invite you to read along with me on the screen from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. This is the one passage that we're just going to talk about today. Most people are familiar with the Easter story, right? And we're working out some kinks with the sound, so just bear with us if it kind of comes in and out. We're trying to fix it so that it doesn't hurt your ears this morning. Most people are familiar with the Easter story, so we're not going to read parts of it. Just in case you're not familiar, here's the fastest sermon you've ever heard in your entire life. The Easter story is Jesus dies on the cross, is buried, 3 days later is resurrected. There it is, right there. Fastest sermon you've ever heard in your entire life. We're going to focus on the light shining in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. I don't think we can skip over Good Friday and jump into Sunday just pretending everything is awesome when everything isn't always awesome. Do you agree? In your life, is that your experience? That death precedes new life. This is, I think, interwoven into the pattern of growth, the pattern that we see in the universe. So we've probably all been aware of statistics that a growing number of people are leaving church, right? And there's many reasons, and people give reasons why that is. One of the things I think that is because people are given a faith that doesn't reflect their experience in life. So we're going to talk about this here, and which of course leads me to my handy-dandy tricycle. So this is a cool pink tricycle nonetheless, and I thought this would be a great metaphor. And I was going to attempt to ride it down here, but it's a little bit small for me, so I might not attempt to do that. But how many wheels are in a tricycle? 3, you guys get an A+. You showed up to Easter Sunday sermon service, and you got it right. A+ for you, tricycle, 3 cycles, 3 wheels. Anyways, I owe this metaphor to one of my spiritual mentors, Richard Rohr, who talks about faith in light of a tricycle. So there's 3 wheels, and Richard Rohr says the back 2 wheels, back here, are tradition and scripture. And he's a Catholic, by the way, and he critiques Catholicism, I think rightly so. Tradition, meaning whatever faith tradition that you grew up in. If you grew up in the Catholic Church, that's the tradition. It influences your faith. Does that make sense? And what he said is that Catholics have overemphasized the role of tradition. And we've seen this in how hierarchical it is. We've given so much power to the church as an institution and ultimately to the Pope. Now, I like the Pope. Pope Francis is a pretty cool dude, but he has a lot of power in that tradition. So he critiques that. But what Protestants have done is during the Protestant Reformation, we've reacted and we've given power and authority to what Christians call the Bible, our scripture. And I think we've elevated that perhaps a little bit too much. But what Rohr's point is that both Scripture and tradition influence us as people of faith. But then, what would you say is the most important wheel in the tricycle? The front one? The front one steers. It also has the cool pink pedals, right? So the front wheel is the wheel driving the tricycle. And so Rohr would say that it's actually, the front wheel is symbolic of experience, our experience in life. I think our experience is the thing that drives our faith, whether we're willing to admit it or we're conscious of it or not. And I've seen this played out in different ways. Some people are taught that being gay is a sin, and then somebody comes out as gay that they know, or they themselves deal with their own sexuality. Their experience shifts, and now they have an experience, and their tradition and how they've interpreted Scripture say one thing, but their experience says something else, and now they're left trying to make sense of this. Now, there might be a period where your tradition and your interpretation of Scripture and your experience don't line up, so there's some dissonance, some disconnect, some confusion that can happen as a result. But my view, my thought is, most of the time, your experience in the end will win out. And you'll have to be forced to either forego your tradition and your view of Scripture, or you'll use your experience to reinterpret your tradition and the way you read and understand the Bible. Is this making sense, I hope? Some people are taught that divorce is always a sin. And then they see a couple, and they see someone struggling with physical abuse or emotional abuse or something else, and everyone around them is saying, no, you need to stay together. It's God's will. If you separate, you're sinning. You're rebelling against God. And yet in their experience, they're thinking, how can this be God's will for this person? It doesn't make sense that it's sin to leave an unhealthy relationship. It just doesn't make sense. So their experience forces them to either leave their tradition and their faith or reinterpret it in new ways. Another example of this, many people are taught God is in control in such a way that God kind of seems like a puppeteer, right? Pulling all of the strings of everything in the world. But what happens when you have a good friend of yours that gets sick, diagnosed with a terminal illness, or even cancer, that may or may not be terminal? And you start thinking, why did God cause this person to have this sickness? And your experience, what about me? I'm not sick. Why am I not sick? And how come they are? Or how come this person's not? Is it random? Does God just say, hey, Mark, I'm going to give you cancer, boom. And hey, Victoria, I'm going to pass over you. You're healthy. That's okay. And on and on. Is that how God interacts in the world? Our experience drives our faith. And while tradition and Scripture influence us and help balance the tricycle of faith, our experience is the thing that drives it. I think a growing number of people are leaving the church because they've been given a faith that is static. They've been given or handed a faith. Here you go. This is my faith. Now give it to your kids. Here you go. It's the exact same faith in the exact same way that's been passed down through generations. It's a static faith. It's you accept this box, and here you go. You pass it on to the next one. Here's the problem. The universe is dynamic. Our lives, our bodies, the universe itself is expanding. Everything is growing, evolving, changing, and yet to expect faith to be exactly the same. No wonder while people are going through life and growth and everything else and experiencing new things, they feel like faith is like a box and it restricts them. So our experience of life and everything else is if things aren't growing, then they're dying. No wonder people look at faith and say, that's outdated, old-fashioned. And that worked then, but we live in a different world now. I think, thankfully, faith can and should be dynamic. It should be growing, evolving, changing. The struggle is, with a dynamic faith, brings a lot of confusion, uncertainty, sometimes disequilibrium, sometimes we're not certain. It's not as clear as a black and white box. Is this making sense? Because life is reflected of that. You live your life. You think you have everything together. I used to think people in their 30s were so old and wise. And then I got to my 30s and I'm like, they have no stinking clue. They're just trying to figure it out. When am I going to start feeling like I know what I'm talking about? Life changes and evolves, and you grow and expand, and it forces you to grow and expand with it. So we here at One Church, we say questions and doubts are welcome, which we believe that faith is actually a vital faith only when you wrestle with it, only when it is dynamic, which means today that there are people here in this room and watching live stream that during Easter, they are thinking resurrection, and they believe that Jesus physically, literally rose from the dead. And then there are people who do not believe that here. And then there are people, perhaps if I was going to guess, the greatest percentage of people who are just like, I don't know. I'm in this space of I'm not sure what I think about the resurrection right now. I think there's a lot of people there. In fact, Great Britain just came out with a survey that said about 25% of Christians in Great Britain, and you can find this on BBC, 25% do not believe in a literal physical resurrection. So all of this to say, first of all, as the pastor here of One Church, wherever you are on that spectrum, we strive to make a space for you, and that you are welcome here. And I know immediately there's some pushback in some religious circles. Well, if you don't believe in a physical, literal resurrection, then why are you even a Christian? Or are you even a Christian? Think about that for a moment. Where does that place faith? The right beliefs about God. So if I believe the right things about God, it's like God sitting up and somewhere, usually up high on a throne. That's how we picture it. And saying, Mark, I don't know, you're just right here, so you get picked on today. Mark, you believe the right things, so you're going to heaven. Caroline, you believe the wrong things, so you're going to hell. And people's experience then doesn't reflect that, and they're like, why does God seem so arbitrary? If that is the point of faith, is this making sense here this morning? And so people struggle with this concept of God. It's a transactional view of God. If I say the right things, whoa, I'm going to heaven. If I don't, well, dang it, it's going down, right? You're going to the bad place. I met with somebody this past week who shared their own struggle and said, I don't know right now what I believe about the physical, literal resurrection. But they said this, I do know in my experience, my life, that as I follow the way and the teachings of Jesus, it leads me to wholeness, healing, and what Jesus called abundant life. What is this person reflecting? Their tradition has taught them something, the way they interpret Scripture has taught them something, but their experience is teaching them something. They can't just walk away from faith completely, and yet following the way and the teachings of Jesus has impacted them in such a way that it's actually meaningful. It applies to their own experience. So part of this is just wrestling with the question, what does it mean to be a Christian? Which we continue to do, I think, here at One Church. What does it mean to be a Christian? Does it mean you believe the right things about God or Jesus or the cross? Or is it about following a path, a way of life? The first Christians were called followers of the way. They followed Jesus. What is Jesus' core teaching? Love. Love is a difficult thing. It demands a lot. So if people believe certain things, are they walking in greater ways in love? I had an analogy too that I forgot to say that I'll just throw it out there because I love this show, Elf. Anybody else seen the movie Elf? You can tell I'm a Will Ferrell fan, right? The Lego movie and now Elf. Will Ferrell plays Buddy the Elf. And in that show, Santa's sleigh does not fly, right? Why? Because not enough people believe about the right things in Santa, right? And so it seems very childish and a little naive to think that God somehow operates the same way. Like, God is so insecure, we have to believe the right things about God. And then you look at the world and its diversity, and you see people believe one thing, and others believe another thing, and others believe another thing. And is it really all about the right beliefs, or is there something more going on here? I think Jesus taught a way of living, a way that leads to healing, to wholeness. Our growth leads us through death into new life. So what does the Easter story tell us? The Easter story tells us that in the midst of our pain, in the midst of our darkness, in the midst of the struggle, that God is walking through it with us. One of my favorite texts in all of the scripture is Jesus hanging on the cross. You're probably familiar with it. And he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it's unfortunate, I think, that some people have taken that one text and made this whole theology. I would say it's a destructive theology about God turning God's back on Jesus because he couldn't stand to be around sin somehow. Rather, I think Jesus is hanging on the cross in the midst of the darkness and in the midst of the pain, reflecting the very experience you and I have all had in our lives. God, where are you in all of this? The fact that Jesus experienced that himself somehow brings me a little bit of hope. That God was working even in the midst of that, through the cross, through death, to bring about new life. Another way of saying it is, through our brokenness comes new beginnings. John 1, verse 5, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Through darkness, through pain, new life is birthed forth. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness does not and will not overcome it. That's the Easter story. It gives us hope and faith that even in the midst of everything else, when the world seems so dark, that somehow, in some way, God is working, even when we don't feel like God is working, or even when we're praying and we're like, I don't see anything. My prayers feel like they're just echoing, bouncing off the wall. Where is God in the midst of this? The Easter story says that God is working through it all to bring about resurrection. God's providing a way when there seems to be no way. So this morning, I suspect that if we reflect on our own life, we've all had times of death and resurrection, of pain and darkness, and seeing God work in our own life in ways that during those times were hard to see and understand. But in hindsight, as we reflect back, we're like, oh, God was working in this way, doing this thing to bring about this other thing that I never even imagined. And sometimes it does mean walking through really difficult situations. So for those of us here this morning who are walking through a darkness of our own, a season of struggle, the Easter story reminds us that the light will not be overcome by the darkness. And for those of us here this morning who are like, I'm not going through anything really hard right now, what does this mean for me? The challenge is even more so. Glennon Doyle Melton, yes. She talked about the cliche answers, right, that people give. And everything happens for a reason, right? Don't worry, God is in control. It'll all work out. For me, what this feels like when I've had those things said to me, it feels like if life is like a river and you're rafting down life, it feels like somehow you've hit some whitewater rapids, you've been bumped off the raft, somehow your life vest just got torn off, you're just barely staying afloat. And you have enough breath to come up, to take a breath, and then you get pummeled by another whitewater rapid, and somebody is sitting on the raft, right, completely dry, with a paddle and a freaking life vest, saying, don't worry, it's all going to be okay, right? And you just want to take that paddle and say, you get off and get in here, right? It doesn't help. That's what life feels like when you're going through those hard times. And we all go through those hard times. So what does it mean then for people of faith? I think this is what it means. If we have faith that God is indeed working, and we see people walking through those dark times, it means we get off of the raft and swim with them. And that is extremely hard. That, I think, is reflective of the whole story of Jesus. What does Jesus do? He gets out of his safety and swims alongside of people in the midst of the pain, in the midst of the darkness, and he walks through life with them. If you and I really believe that God is working, then we'll walk through that with others. In fact, I think the greatest gift you have to give to others in the midst of their pain is your presence. And this kind of echoes what Glennon Doyle Milton said. That's the greatest gift. But it's extremely hard. Why? Because we want to fix it. We want to give answers. We want to try to make sense of everything. And it's really, really hard to sit with somebody in the midst of that. Because this is what happens. You and I, we walk through that darkness with them, which means we experience that. You get out of the raft, now you're in the whitewater rapids. Now you feel like you're struggling with your own life. Now you wonder, where is God in the midst of all of this? Because I don't know. My friend who's walking through cancer asking, why did this happen to me? Now you're asking the same thing. I don't know why this happened. I'm here. It's also uncomfortable, right? Because you're sitting with them thinking, I wish I could fix it somehow, make it all better. Just know this, your presence, being there with them, is the greatest gift you have to offer as people of faith. Hold on to the Easter story that says through the darkness, through the pain, God is still working. Does that make sense? The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. So this morning, as we conclude, a short sermon message, isn't that brief? The hope is that we have is that God is working through it all. That's the hope that we carry in the midst of it all. And the way we reflect that to others is by being present with them. It's unfortunate that Christians have become known as judgmental, hypocritical, all kinds of negative things, where in reality we should be people most willing to walk through pain with others, not provide all of the cliche pat answers, because we believe that somehow God is working in the midst of it all. If we believe that God created this whole thing somehow, and God's heart, God's dream is for all things to flourish, then that's our goal. That's what we're here for. So wherever we see life, we're jumping in, and yes, we believe in that. We're a part of that. Wherever we see darkness, we're walking through it with other people, not because we can fix it, but because we really believe in the Easter story, that through the darkness, God is working. God has not given up, and that eventually resurrection will happen. And as Jacob prayed, it might look very differently than we had thought or imagined. And yet we walk through that with other people.